is presenting. Just really appreciating you coming to attend this. Perhaps you were also maybe as confused as I was as a lawyer about the real breadth and broadness of the title of this panel, environmental, legal issues, and cannabis. I mean, the issues can really be so wide and so diverse. So, I wanted to structure the talk around what the strengths of my panelists would be, and I'll get to introducing them. And literally just before walking into the room, one of my co-panelists, Xavier Rebello's grand passed away, so he unfortunately has had to exit, which now gives me, I suppose, the ability to have to very quickly rejig this panel to still align with what I had hoped a message to get across, which I think is a very important one. But I think what I've really liked about this conference and the symposium is that it's not a trade show where you're coming and where you're being pushed low-cost facility weed, not by White Lion Holdings, by others. People here have been speaking the truth, which I think is so important, because a lot of the cannabis symposiums and conferences, much of the talk is really around hype. And not really grounded in some of the hard lessons that perhaps the mature first mover markets in the global north took. So, I want to talk about how we can make cannabis environmental policy work for Africa, and then to hopefully resonate to other parts of the world. And because environmental issues really aren't something that's usually covered at cannabis symposiums, being an environmental lawyer myself, kind of frothed at this opportunity to speak about environmental legal issues. Of course, they are, as I mentioned, such a broad, diverse field. And, I think because the regulation of cannabis has evolved so rapidly, it's kind of intersected with, say, the AI race, this rapid adoption and build-out of AI data centers. So when we look at it from a resource perspective, there are many cumulative impacts from other industries which aren't considered when we design cannabis policy, but we probably have to consider. So kind of how I want to structure this next, probably won't be a full hour, but the next 40 minutes or so is around how the single biggest environmental win that we have the opportunity with in designing cannabis policy is to make outdoor-grown cannabis the default position. In that way, the environment wins. But a policy that favors outdoor first as a default also serves very important social justice imperatives and policy choices too. So I somehow wanted to build this panel backwards by grounding it in who will be my first voice, which is Christophe Lardinois. Many of you might know him or recognize him as Christo Congo. So he's got a master's in African languages and cultures, and he spent his working life inside cannabis cultivation in Europe, but especially in Africa, in Congo, and then also in Pondoland. So I think many of you are aware that Christo will be doing the world premiere of a very important movie later tonight. This panel is not to talk about that movie, but of course there's important concepts that come out of that movie that I would like Christo to just take us through as well. So, what I want Chris to show us is that the low impact cultivation, what that actually looks like, and how we kind of are on the verge of even destroying these ancient practices by not having designed them into our frameworks from the outset. I then mentioned that my second panelist was going to be an esteemed legal academic, and I've now had to pivot and really bring in one of my good friends, Peter Nell, the co-founder of, and I'm probably biased here, but the leading cannabis manufacturer in South Africa. So any of you in the global markets would probably know GES Labs. Really, I think one of South Africa's greatest success stories of the cannabis sector, and how if you look at this with the right intentions and realize that this is a long game. So I think the biggest problem in the whole cannabis industry is that many looked at this as really a new sector, new opportunity to make money quickly. Like no industry works like that, and especially not cannabis, and especially not what I think people don't really talk about this. Cannabis is a teacher plant itself. And I think when you adopt many of these corporate kind of lenses to it, you lose the kind of its ability to connect. So I'd ask Pete just to come join to add another perspective, but also especially because I want to be kind of grounding this panel and the environmental importance of outdoor first land stewards as environmental stewards. We've done some R&D work together with these farmers in Pondoland especially, so to perhaps potentially talk about whether there is a place in the global marketplace for African cannabis in more premier products, not necessarily flower, but potentially in the extracts. And then also, there's a lot of this, I think, disconnect around, well, these farmers can't farm GACP, but so I want to pose some questions to Pete around, how important is that if you're making a GMP extract? So we'll get through that. Then for those of you that don't know me, my name's Ricky Stone. I like to say I've been in this cannabis space for long before it became popular to give advice in the sector. So a lot of people probably don't like the advice I give, and that's because not the advice that they want to hear, which is that their business model is not necessarily operating in a grey area, but it's plainly unlawful. So, aside from maybe laws of taxation, which have some loopholes and grey areas, most of the law, at least in this country, is pretty black and white. So it has led to a very unfortunate situation in South Africa on the one hand, because we've got thousands of what are purely illegal outlets that are obviously bringing big economic benefits. But on the other hand, it's kind of the silver lining is that the private sector moving faster than government has forced this government, at least South African government, to accept that they have to regulate adult use cannabis. But how you go about retrofitting and including now 8,000 plus unlawful outlets, I suppose, is something that's made my job a lot more difficult, because I mentioned I've been in this for a long time, so my kind of work with cannabis was with Amapondo farmers to put in place a legal strategy to challenge the South African government, who had been spraying glyphosate from helicopters. Some of you might know Roundup, Kilomax, those glyphosate-containing products. So spraying that over 50,000 hectares of Pondo land, rural indigenous cultivation. So I got involved advising those farmers, putting in place a legal strategy to end the area eradication program. And then, as things often do, especially when you work with teacher plants, things go full circle. So now I have the massive responsibility of advising the South African government and helping hold their hand to design policy that really does make things work in the sector. So, maybe let me just move into some questions then with my panelists. I wanted Christo to maybe just explain to those of you also that maybe haven't got any knowledge on kind of some of the history around cannabis in Southern Africa, how communities in the DRC, and you spent a lot of time in Pondoland, what are their cultivation methods kind of currently? Accepting that they might not be to a GACP standard, but from a impact, a purely an environmental impact. What impact do these small-scale farmers have on the environment through their practices?
You want me to speak like this, or should I take the mic?
These built-in mics that are supposedly working.
I started being involved in cannabis since 2016 in the DRC immediately. When there was an initial project started up there Franco Loggia passed away. He was the initiator of the Greenhouse project in the DRC. And when he passed away, actually, I stepped in and took over from that point. So I was kind of dropped into it. I never chose the plant. Well, as a younger, yes, but I guess the plant chose me at that point. And I've also always known cannabis as an outdoor grown plant because that's how we do it in the DRC. And that's also the reason why Greenhouse Seed Company chose those favorable conditions, because you can grow cannabis indoors, under your lights, you can tweak everything perfectly, the amount of water of feeding, the light intensity, yes, temperature, but there's one crucial ingredient that you will be missing, and that is the sun. You're not farming cattle under artificial light, and if you sit the whole day in an office under light like this, you're not going to be happy. So a plant is exactly reacting the same to that, and we see that also in the production. Outdoor grown seeds are of very good quality. They are big, they are massive, they are strong. That's what we want, and that's because they have the secret ingredient. So the secret ingredient is the ingredient, which is the sun. So I've always known cannabis as an outdoor grown plant. If we go into indigenous landrace grown by local communities, as I discovered them for the first time in the DRC, of course, it's of course the way people have been growing it for generations and generations. They've known nothing else. The same for Mpondo land. That specific strain grows well in the Umzimvubu Valley, and nothing else is growing there. So they are also dependent on cannabis as being the only crop actually that grows there. So it's being treated as their main source of income, and so being treated also with love. The inputs that local communities put into the growing of cannabis is of course very limited, because budget-wise is limited. You're not going to be spraying or pumping or whatever external feeding appliance, especially when you are growing hectares and hectares. People, they play with the season. You have to choose the right time of planting, play with the rain, do some basic practices like cleaning out the bottom of the plant so you don't have pests crawling up on the set. But besides that, there's not really much input needed in growing local landrace, and I'm talking about landrace. Besides for letting it grow and being there at the times needed. So in that way, impact on the environment is of course minimum. I must say, and I've seen that in the equatorial province in the DRC as well, where people grow and kind of have to hide it. Of course, things have changed a bit now in Congo, but farmers, and Congo is luckily very vast, so you can go hide it kilometers and kilometers far, where nobody's gonna come look for you. But you have to mission to go to the real centers of Congo landrace grown areas. One of them being the equatorial province. So we went there. We walked for hours and hours and hours and hours, finally to reach. And the way people there prepare the plot for planting is by cutting forest, unfortunately. So cutting the trees, burning to clear the area. And there I have to say that's not, that's where I see impact, a negative impact. And there's a kind of perception in Congolese that resources are endless. And that's why there's always a huge hunt for bushmeat. That's why also if you want to buy woods, and we were building our structures with woods in the DRC, my wood supplier he always had to go further and further and further to find trees to cut. And I asked him one day, are you also planting trees for every tree that you get? Oh no, I've never thought about it. So what's your son, when he grows up, how he's going to take over the business? Oh yeah, maybe it's a good idea for me to plant trees as well. So Congo is so vast, so powerful that the people also use it as an endless resource. Then this example of cutting parts of rainforest for growing ganja, I think is something that we should and could change if also it becomes a bit more regulated in the DRC, that people don't have to be afraid of growing this crop, and also that we can kind of valorize the landrace crop. I see many people stepping into the cannabis industry, having this idea that it needs to be indoor grown or that it needs to be tunnel grown, and that only then it's going to be good. There's a big license holder who obtained a license now also in the DRC again, who made their calculation based on unrealistic prices that they think they're going to get per kilo. So they are like, okay, if we throw a few millions here, we're going to build a nice infrastructure with moving tables, and it's going to all be climate controlled. But climate controlled in the DRC, what you're going to do? You have to put power to AC to get the temperature down again, to be able to properly grow. So those are things that I don't see. Now they have to get the exclusive contract with the SNEL, which is the national electricity provider, to pull a line uniquely for this facility, and they are willing to pay because they think they're going to make it back in one crop, which of course isn't true. But so that's being done. If you can pay, you can get things done, of course, in the DRC. But in the meantime, the whole of Kinshasa, the capital of DRC, people have no power. They have no electricity. But we're going to do this for this plant. Why? You can grow it outdoors. Of course, you are exposed to the elements a bit more. So you can have wind and you can have failure, of course. But I think that's for me. Is if you want to focus on high-grade cannabis for the medicinal market, or you want to valorize the landrace for the medicinal market, outdoor grown, sun grown is for me really the most sustainable.
Thanks so much, Chris. And I'm very happy that Chris actually touched on kind of the clearance of native indigenous forests to make way for cannabis cultivation. I've often liked to say that one of the greatest costs to the environment and one of the biggest harms of cannabis was actually prohibition itself. So it is prohibition largely. I mean, Chris mentioned that if there were legal ways for these farmers to cultivate, they potentially wouldn't go further and further into the forest. In Ponderland, that happened because the police for 2 decades were spraying probable carcinogenic from helicopters over homesteads, waterways, children, maize crops to get the cannabis, which is right next to the homestead. So the farmers would go deeper and deeper into the indigenous forest to clear for cultivation and try place their cultivation plots under power lines where there is electricity. So often I think a lot of these environmental costs actually come from prohibition itself, and that we would hopefully see less negative impacts from communities. I mean, environmental management and resource custodianship is a complex thing. But I just want you maybe, before I ask Peter a few questions, maybe just explain what your observations are on the relationship between, say, the Amapondo people, even people in the Congo, and the relationship they have with the land. Is there a sacred connection that these communities and people have with the land in your observations? Or do they just look at it as a field to cultivate, a crop to harvest for money? Or is there a deeper connection between the people and the plant that grow it?
There's definitely a deep connection between people in their land. We've been looking for land in the DRC as well to implement new projects, wanting to buy land. There's people who are willing to sell land, but I also went to a local chief who refused to even talk about selling land. He wanted to rent the land to me, but he's not going to sell it because he's thinking about his grandchildren, the next generation. He wants to leave them something valuable, which is the land. In Mpondo land, where I just was last week, and where I was last year for the shooting of the documentary. The area that I visited, Amadiba land is holy. We have this conflict. That's the story that we're telling in the documentary screening tonight, where in 2006-2007 a mining company wanted to start mining this 25-kilometer coastal stretch for titanium, which meant that all the people who were living there had to kind of move and displace the area, and there was a huge struggle and conflict within the communities, people wanting the mine, people being against the mine, and that's when Cannabis actually, by coincidence, came in with a project initiated by Franco as well. The mining company actually never put a spade in the ground. All their materials were vandalized, even because the people were refusing to give up that land, even for no matter what compensation, even for no matter what job you were be promised at the mining company and like a monthly income. People refuse to give up that land. They are really proud of that, and I find that so and enormously powerful that they stood for that. And that's a beautiful thing is actually that Cannabis gave them a kind of force of economic independence to be able to say no to even a mining company. So the whole history of the people there is around ganja and is around the land, what it can produce for you, also food crop, of course.
Thanks, Chris. I mean, that was very useful. I think because that is really, and it speaks to also going back to basics and using existing tools that we have at our disposal in existing laws. While we talk about writing new laws and crafting cannabis-specific policy. So, I mean, there's a concept in environmental law which is known as environmental stewardship. It's a recognized principle. It's an environmental protection mechanism. And what Chris has just said illustrates that these communities are the true environmental protectors. They don't look at land as just a square or rectangle to be planted and cultivated and harvested, rinse and repeat next season. These people are deeply connected to their land, to all natural resources, and really don't see any distinction between the more physical human environment and the physical environment. And having worked with these same communities, the story that Chris's movie will show is so instrumental, because not only did the breed, and it's an important point, because these communities became economically independent through the cultivation of cannabis for seed production, only seed production, not flower, not hemp purposes. But that seed run that took place gave them this economic freedom to really motivate and organize themselves to resist in development that was imposed on them and on their ancestral land. So first an Australian mining company that wanted to mine titanium. Next, the national government to impose a toll road through ancestral land and over ancestral graves. Through indigenous resources, they managed to reroute the toll road. And then more recently, opposing a multinational oil company, Royal Dutch Shell, to oppose their seismic surveying of the ocean to search for oil and gas. So if you look at how a single tiny cannabis seed created truly an economic revolution that has had benefits to the environment well outside of cannabis. Because of that single community, we have at least 8 court judgments which have changed our law forever in how our legal system recognizes the rights of indigenous people. And that was started because of cannabis, which shows exactly how powerful communities working with this plant is and what it really can achieve. So, because very often, people, including governments, say, well, we must license those farmers. But why should each farmer apply for a license? What about the farmer whose identity is not yet registered on the national database and who won't be able to actually comply with the application form? What about the household where nobody knows how to read or write? And what about the fact that these are the true custodians of this plant who, and this is important to emphasize, that the Amapolo didn't grow seed for greenhouse. They had been growing seed for 800 years, or not seed, growing cannabis for 8 centuries, And I think a lot of the discussion is obviously it must be grounded in the now, but if we think that humanity's relationship with cannabis extends millennia, 5,000 plus years, the Asians 8,000 years, it's only been prohibited for a century. So, like I said, we must go back and we must look before the 100 years. And if you look there, you see how the people, nothing's changed. These are true environmental stewards who have always conserved this resource through the preservation of land-race genetics and through this very sacred relationship of caring for the land and working with the soil. I want to jump to you quickly, Pete. Because Pete's obviously extracted tons and tons and tons of cannabis. I would assume a lot of it's been indoor cultivated, extracted, and then you would have extracted from outdoor grown cannabis. So maybe you could just, is there any benefit from an extraction point of view to extracting outdoor grown cannabis versus indoor grown? As a manufacturer of, say, pharmaceutical cannabis products, is there actually a space for outdoor grown to feed into the pharmaceutical model? Or is it, as a manufacturer, that you do need absolute indoor control from seed to, say, final product?
Yeah, so I know I look like a mechanic / plumber, but, as my wife says, but I come from a very highly regulated and compliant environment, operating in the strictest environment, having the only EU GMP certification as a manufacturing company for the products that we have in Africa. And to your question, Ricky, from my perspective, it's always come down to the plant and the environment. It's a biological constraint. And for things to be commercially sustainable, for things to be economically feasible, and for things to actually reward and give back, you got to consider the biological constraints. And I think the biological constraints we're seeing in full force at the minute. You've got people that are putting, or companies putting greenhouses in place that are distressed assets, specifically because they don't understand the biological constraints around the plant. It needs to be in an environment that they can produce product at an economically and sustainable manner. And so for our business, we've looked at 2 things. We've looked at the poppy industry in Tasmania, and we've understood the genetic and the lineage down there. And when we investigated the lineage and poppy foundation that kind of births around the world, 87% of the market is monopolized by one company because they understood the biological constraints of the plant. Has to be grown outdoor, and the genetics are incredibly important, specifically on codeine synthesis, but that's a whole other thing. So looking at highly regulated, scheduled substances, outdoor is the way to grow. Now there is another context to say, well, has it been done in cannabis, and specifically in my industry, pharmaceutical cannabis? There's a company called GW Pharma. They come out with the first registered Epidiolex and Sativex as well, which are registered pharmaceutical products. I went and visited their cultivation facility in England last year, and I went to have a look. How does GW Pharma do this? What does the government allow them to do? And they had exactly the same perspective. It's a biological constraint. It needs sustainability. It needs to be grown outdoor. And when I visited their facility, they had combine harvesters. There was no greenhouses. There was no fences. There was nothing. And I was blown away that the leading large pharmaceutical company in the world that has 90% of control of demand grows it outdoor, and everyone is confused about this greenhouse thing. Now, obviously, there's the consumer market. So, for dried flower. I then worked with a very respected professor at the University of Free State called Professor Matsabisa, and he asked me 3 or 4 years ago, Peter, I've been working with Anaponda region in Lisikisiki. I would like you to please, do an R&D project with us where, you could compare your greenhouse cultivated manufactured products versus these rural collected indigenous strains. And the real R&D of this project was to say, okay, well, if we extracted these 2 product sources, would you be able to, characteristically from a quality perspective, show the difference? And we weren't able to show difference. They produced exactly the same product, and we took it all the way to a full pharmaceutical monograph, which is called dronabinol, so pure API. And from a pesticide or anything, you can't tell the difference. So I think many years ago we already proved that you can actually have this concept called the good agricultural rural collection practice, which was the mindset that we had at the time. So that you can bring in an African-centric kind of South African rural collection indigenous framework. Another initiative we work on is scaletium. So we also have that exact same mindset with scaletium, which is an indigenous plant raw material. But just from the science, from the biological constraint perspective, from sustainability, it does not make sense to be growing cannabis in a controlled environment for a manufactured product that has therapeutic use.
Thanks, Peter. I thought that was really interesting. I'm happy that you became my super sub. I think it was just to hear that feedback from around the GW Pharmaceutical. You're not going to read that anywhere, right? And I think Pete has really touched on some very important things there, and especially because he is a manufacturer of cannabis medicine. I think that really it's a nice point to ground why, or maybe to explain how did we get here? How did we get to this situation where we now have an industry where the majority of cannabis is cultivated indoors? I mean, this is quite difficult to estimate carbon, regardless of what many consultants might tell you. But fair estimates say that 1 kilogram of indoor cannabis has a carbon footprint. So 1 kilogram of indoor cannabis has a carbon footprint of 2,500 to 5,000 kilograms of carbon, just for 1 kilo of cannabis. So an outdoor grown cannabis is 50% or 50 times, not percent, 50 times more environmentally friendly. So you have to, I've always asked this question, how did we get to this situation? Really, it's a mess that we're in, right? And it impacts any business in the sector, primarily from their own kind of profit perspective, but it impacts the consumer at the end of the day. So when Steve D'Angelo gave his keynote yesterday morning, he spoke, he used a phrase, the nose under the tent, okay? And that's exactly what it was. The nose is talking about is this phrase, the camel's nose under the tent. And once the camel gets his or her nose under the tent, the whole tent comes down. So in many jurisdictions, any form of cannabis reform was opposed for that exact reason. That opening up medical access without proper frameworks in place would be the camel's nose under the tent. You kind of legalize under the guise of medicine, and that would open up rec markets, which, if any of you listened to Bob Hoban, that Washington to California panel yesterday, you would have understood how California and most jurisdictions, including South Africa, have done exactly that. Medicine first, realize that there's some failures here, then rec, adult use market, then medicine becomes tighter, then medicine maybe goes away, then medicine becomes what medicine truly is. And there's been a lot of this kind of discussion in many of these rooms around that, and in Bob's keynote right now, before this panel, around how did we get to this place where cannabis flower is being prescribed, and not a tincture, a pill, a well-formulated dose product. So, I'm very happy that the Germans are so good at collecting data, because the data that they've collected from their, I'm going to call them experiments, because that's truly what they are, their medical experiments and now their adult use experiments, clearly shows that a lot of the medical cannabis frameworks and policy have been put in place has really been a facade, right? So the German data shows that the patients being prescribed cannabis are young, white, healthy males. You wonder why is the data showing that these people are healthy? They're in a medical program. And that really touches on what Myrtle was complaining about yesterday, this lie to get high, where so many consumers in regulated markets around the world, the only avenue they get to get legal cannabis is through a medical program. So what do? They lie to get high, old rugby injury, sore back, headache, difficult wife, tired from the kids, and boom, you've got it. It would be funny if it didn't have such massive potential reputational consequences for the importance of having tightly regulated medical frameworks and pharmaceutical frameworks around the world. So what you see now in the UK, you've got 10 doctors prescribing upwards of 60% of all prescriptions for medical cannabis. But one of the doctors is giving a prescription every 2 minutes. Now you have to ask, and that's a professional who's taken his oath of office, but he's turned into a script mill, as I call it, which is really what's happened here. So I think I've never been known to kind of take these common positions, and maybe because I also grew up in rural areas of the Eastern Cape with deep connections to land, ocean, soil, and plants. But that we need to call out these medical shams as they exist in markets, because once more and more people do that, and you force pharmaceutical regulators into their lane where they must stay to regulate formulated products, right? So I think because you've gone so far down this road, you can't just undo it all overnight. But I think if we can, the world over, have this situation where people actually are adults, because we have to be adults here, and accept that the majority of the cannabis flower being grown and consumed is adult use, recreational, or self-medication. So all of that could easily fall under outdoor-only framework, and that could be the default. Now, and if that was the default, then indigenous communities such as the Amapondo, the Congolese farmers, the Zulu farmers in South Africa would actually have a place in the sector. They wouldn't have to compete with the indoor-only sector, and on that basis, we could have them kind of grandfathered in as well into our legal systems to design these policies that really are designed around these lower cost cultivation type of footprints that these farmers have. So, the point I really wanted to then make from the environmental side, other jurisdictions like California's entire policies around water, because water is such an important thing to California, as it is to South Africa. But our it's purely medical cultivation framework. SAHPRA don't want to know if you've got a water use license. Most facilities actually need a water use license. They don't have it. Most of them need an environmental authorization. They don't have it, because our framework and policy puts medical first and medical only. And it's not to say that applicants and license holders didn't need to comply with other law. They did, but it was never made a precondition of licensing, that you must first show your water use license, show your environmental authorization. So, I think the point I wanted to make was that one of the biggest positive environmental impacts we can make is not necessarily how much water you use or using less water. It's literally centered on how we grow. Is it outdoor or is it indoor? I know we're running out of a bit of time here, and I'm sure maybe you want to.
Yeah, I just want to give
add something, Pete. Sure.
Like, just on the whole environmental thing. I just spent a whole week in Zimbabwe last week, and was once the breadbasket of Africa, and the farmers just desperate for something. It's how broken the system is with the medical lab, and the pricing, and no access, and lie to get a high kind of framework. Tobacco has destroyed the environment in Zimbabwe, absolutely wrecked it. The soil is not fertile, the fertilizers, the pesticides, it's wrecked the breadbasket of Africa. Now, to bring cannabis in there, an outdoor crop, the system is so broken right now that an outdoor crop, the medical market and the consumer high to get high kind of framework has pushed the price so down that it can't even compete against tobacco on an outdoor crop. For me, that is, growing, firstly, a massive harm to society with tobacco plants, and secondly, destroying the environment. And the framework is so broken that the biological economics don't make sense for guys to actually grow cannabis now instead of tobacco. For me, that's the essence of what we're trying to solve here from an outdoor grow, stopping the lie to get high. If we fix that, farmers can actually change their crops from an economic perspective. So that was just a little thing I wanted to put out there. I spent the whole week in Zimbabwe now trying to understand, can these guys actually do outdoor crops? And the farmer said, we can't, because the price is $1 per gram, because the medical system is so broken. So it's just these sorts of really intricate things that we need to consider.
Thank you so much for adding that perspective too. Are there any, maybe we could just take a few questions before I give one or two last ones to my panelists. Any burning questions?
So one thing I would say, like obviously switching over to an outdoor grow, do you think that would be something that moves, I guess, from SAPRA to reg, and would it, or to agricultural, and then would it mean that you could, in a way, cultivate at any point? Because I know anyone outdoor grow, whichever can grow good, clean flower, and that is at the end of the day the main thing. If you're going towards a recreational market or Section 21 or medical, you have to know that it's clean. But would you be able to? Everyone can cultivate how they want to cultivate, but what market you want to enter after that determines what regulations you have to go with. Is that a framework that we could see actually working? You could grow it how you want to grow it, just where you want to sell it, you have to follow certain steps and guidelines for that.
Yes, look, I think I'll let you touch on that, Pete. I think that's definitely, there's already kind of policy momentum that it will. Once you treat cannabis as an agricultural commodity, all cultivation would be regulated by an agricultural department or by officials within, say, a cannabis regulatory authority that are agronomists, that actually understand the crop. And I think it's difficult enough to farm as is. So I've always said you need to place we need to, from a lawyer, when you regulate design policy, what are the harms that you're trying to mitigate here? And all of those harms are harms to society, consumers. The farm is not causing the harm by planting. So the regulation needs to be softer on farmers and cultivators, and really, I think we need to focus our regulations around end-use markets. So you cultivate your crop. If your crop is fit to go into a pharmaceutical value chain, then that's where you go. If it's too low quality, it potentially could go into, maybe it's not even good enough quality for an adult use market, but can potentially go into ingredients, manufacturing, extraction of potentially terpenes or something for food and beverage and that type of stuff. Pete, you look like you wanted to maybe add to that.
Do you eat food from the shops, right? Now different shops are going to, different retailers are going to have different regulations. I think the one example I want to pinpoint here is Coca-Cola. These guys are still extracting coca extracts in South America, right? They are making pharmaceutical grade cocaine for the pharmaceutical industry, which is used for dental industry, and they're taking a decoconized extract and using it in Coca-Cola. That's a legitimate supply chain. The plant is grown outdoor, it's actually rural collected. They've got agreements in place with indigenous people there, growing the coca plant, which is an indigenous thing, and they're taking it to the pharmaceutical supply chain. And they've got 2 factories. You know, it comes in, decoconized extract, that's the suitable raw material for food, and that gets into the pharmaceutical supply chain. These are very well established means of doing it. Same with Canada and America. Good production food practice is what's used internationally. So these are not
Nothing new.
Nothing new. Yeah.
It seems like it would be great if our officials knew to read onto that.
I think the difference here is that we're dealing with something that has been put into the Medicines Act as a scheduled substance, and that's the decouple that we need to do.
You know, I think that is the important point. And it went back also to one of the earlier ones, which I was trying to get across, is how we got into this mess, and it was because this reform was driven, starting in Canada, and then literally, if any of you saw our first copy of the cultivation guideline, the medical ones for South Africa, still had the word Vancouver in the draft guidelines, which made it very clear, at least to me, that it was a really bad copy-paste job.
It wasn't even proofread.
Yeah, but yeah, we are, you know what I mean, and now we need to navigate through this. And you know, Chris, I wanted to, I mean, I don't know, the Congolese, they haven't necessarily created any legal frameworks, right? So I mean,
Yes, there is now.
okay, there is a
Finally.
Okay, there finally is. Well, maybe you can give us some insights
a lot of years.
into that. I mean, so you've seen there in Congo, you've worked with the farmers before the law arrives to recognize, protect them. What has been the impacts of the? Are they included in the frameworks?
Yes. It's huge actually. It took us a lot of conferences with the ministries, the local religious people, the Christian, the Muslim, the traditional. So it was huge conferences already to get everybody into a kind of understanding that this plant, which has always had a notion that it's linked to banditism and criminalism and losing your mind. Government officials in the DRC still not 100%. We have to explain the difference between THC and CBD 100 times before they capture that, but they understood now the value of the plant. And I remember the religious group had to do a little group meeting and then present their results to the rest of all the people present there. And I remember the one who took the word, he said, it's written in the Bible that everything God created, all plants are made to serve humankind. So that's a positive thing, and then the Congolese constitution changed after that, from being zero tolerance, no possession, no growing allowed, which is old colonial law, of course. You know, before that, cannabis was grown more visible, but when colonialism came, they prohibited it and then put it in the constitution, and the constitution is now changed with an exception for medical use. So that was already a very important thing. It took then a while, many more years again, for the DRC also to register in the international framework, it being the INCB, the International Cannabis Control Board, as an exporting country. First there was an idea in the head like, can we not just pay someone? You know, you cannot just pay someone. You have to follow international rules for that. So Congo can export now, which is really good. And now it's actually to the different license holders to see how they wanna play that out. The project that I'm involved with now, we are really looking into landrace and having the local farmers involved, get their produce and then extracted it because exporting flower from DRC also logistically it's not going to work because you are landlocked. It can take 3 weeks at customs because some guy wants to complicate you, so the flower is already going to be destroyed. So you have to make already a first extraction step. And we see big value in working with the landrace, of course, valorizing the landrace and the medicinal purposes that it has.
Thanks so much, Chris. I thought that was really useful perspective as well. And it goes also to Bob's earlier point that we look to our governments for all these answers, but they don't have them. So I mean, Chris's what he's just illustrated shows, how it really is those that in the private sector and in the communities that understand this plant that have to sit down around the same table with religious leaders, with government, to craft this policy together. I think maybe Pete, because I really want you just to a final kind of parting shot here, because Chris has spoken about the valorization of the African land races, of origin grown cannabis. Is there potential premium because of terroir? We've got other crops work like this. Coffee is a prime example where the origin and the terroir gives you a premium in the marketplace, much like South African wine. Sure, it took 3 centuries to establish that you get a premium in the market because of the soil you grow it in and the relationship the farmer has with the land. Do you think, Pete, as a pharmaceutical manufacturer, that there's a place for, say, African sun-grown but extracted products, particularly, say, landrace or even potentially hybrid bred, kind of as like a sovereignty type of position as well, or do you see the global marketplace continuing to be dominated by single cannabinoid formulations?
So that's a good question. I go to Germany often for obvious reasons. We sell a lot of product there. And I work with a lot of pharmacists there. And you just walk into any German pharmacy and you see one big, massive section in the corner they call Umkalabo, which is a pelargonium. We call it Pelargonium sedoides, right? And it's a traditional plant. Everyone knows it's from South Africa. And I asked him, what do the German patients think of this Umkalabo? They put like a baobab tree there with like a sun and the whole shebang. They genuinely see Africa, they feel it, they know that this is something that's gonna make their cough and flu go away, and they're willing to pay for that. Massive market, probably 40 billion euros a year. This pelargonium thing, right? Also another whole topic that just really annoys me. But this Umkalabo thing, so there's a huge connection, funny enough, in these European and North American countries that look at African botanicals and really want to introduce them into their diet, into their therapeutic kind of self-treatment process. So not just that, but the fair trade, the benefit sharing, it brings such an organic sustainability aspect from an economic perspective that, yes, the premium does exist.
Thanks, Pete. I think that was very important to also illustrate that example to the Pelagorium and that Umkalabo product, which it's been existed. So some of you might know, all of you, I guarantee, have used it. So if you've used Linctagon, the API, the active pharmaceutical ingredients in that is Pelagorium. Of course, exists differently in the medical market. But so you got to ask, so 40 billion euro industry. That plant only grows in the Eastern Cape. Drakensberg, Eastern. Anyway, it only grows in this country, South Africa. The market exists in Europe, and it's 40 billion euro a year. Those euros don't flow this way.
Is the benefit sharing happening? No.
It happened a very long time ago, before Nagoya protocols, protocols. So it's biopiracy of the past, and it is, maybe there'll be a conference on Pelagorium one day. But I think it's very important. I'll get to you now for a final question there. That these discussions show us as South Africans the real economic opportunity, we're standing at a new frontier here. You're seeing entire financial frameworks around the world being redesigned, nature capital frameworks, biodiversity credits coming forward, all of these type of things, and bioeconomy is a big drive in biotech. So, I like to say cannabis is just one single plant in the basket of indigenous plants that our communities have. They're not necessarily monocrop type farmers. They're usually cultivating many medicinal plants, and I think in time, the models we use to include them in cannabis legal reform policies can similarly be used for other type of plants to include them at very low cost. But you raised your hand there, so I'm going to give you the opportunity to ask a question, even though we are going to have to conclude. But see, I'm a lawyer, so I sell my time, and we start bobbling over, which means we started 8 minutes late, which means we still have 3 minutes.
All right, I'll make my question quick. So I was having a thought that yes, the certification and regulation of cannabis is necessary just for the consumer end of it to ensure you know what you're getting. But I think maybe a answer, not the answer, might be in the way it's marketed. So Pete just mentioned that this product is overseas making 40 billion a year, and half of what I picked up from his comment is that it's because it's from Africa. You know what I mean?
100%.
They're buying into the Africanness of the product, and is there not a way that we as cannabis can re-Africanize it? So as much as the medical space needs it to be clean, sterilized, grown indoor, yes, that can be a standard and that can be pushed to a specific market, but what if the African version of it being grown outside is actually the healthier version, and that then gets marketed and sold as the premium?
I'm getting goosebumps here because that's exactly what we're actually trying to do as a company at the minute. That's why I was in Zimbabwe.
Yeah.
There's a huge opportunity here. These companies are distressed assets right now, because they should not be cultivating cannabis the way that they are. And so there is, and this is, the reality here is that if you're in this industry, we're at the beginning. It feels like we are behind. There's still 100 years here that we need to catch up on, right? We're at 10% of the journey. Those that came in early, rushed in, not understanding the long-term decade perspective, So I think from that narrative, it will come 100,000%, but it's going to take time because the truth always balances itself out, especially when you have to deal with sustainability, economic feasibility, all that sort of stuff. So the stuff will naturally balance out, and re-Africanization will 100% happen. But you just got to be committed to probably a 2-decade journey, which I'm all in,
Yeah, thanks so much for asking that question and for answering it, Pete. And I think, although it will take those 2 decades, you must remember that Africa and South African cannabis is already known in the global marketplace. The world knows Durban Poison and Pondo Gold. Many of these modern day hybrid varieties originated from that cannabis DNA. So, I think it's obviously you've got to package the story, the origin story, and make it more marketable. But I don't think it'll be a big leap because African cannabis is already known to the global marketplace. So thanks to you all for joining. You maybe want to add one final parting shot.
Well, I was talking about the Congo Red and the Congo Black. If you can only mention that name, it's something mystical hanging over it. So yeah, definitely it can work really good if you properly market that or whatever.
I just wanted to add to that as well. So that's amazing, and that's an incredible way we should be going with the African side. I just wanted to bring the human rights into it, and whilst we can market the African story as best we can until we stop our people being arrested for the exact same thing, I think we need to start there and make sure we get that right before we start telling to the rest of the world, because our people are being arrested for the exact same thing.
Yeah, thanks, Amy, for adding that perspective. And I think, really just as a final point here, I hope we kind of touched on this enough to show that the best environmental policy to protect cannabis, protect the environment, is the same policy that ensures protection of human rights, recognition of decade and century-old practices. So we often look at these things as separate type of policies, but really they are the same thing. So and really the thing about I think cannabis policy and development of legal frameworks is the importance to recognise how integrated it is, because what South Africa has a huge tourism opportunity. So if you think of the rural tourism opportunity just around cannabis, I mean, I have many friends from America and even Europe that consume cannabis legally in those countries have never ever touched a cannabis plant. They're not allowed to cultivate it themselves, and you're not allowed into the factory farms, that side. So just to have tours of indigenous fields there's already a massive market, So I think that is to look at this plant as to how can we, especially for the environmental custodians of the land and of our natural resources, like cannabis, design policies that aren't just focused on the premium for the flower or for the extract or for the herb, but how do you look at this as more than just a commodity? Because that's the real thing. Cannabis isn't just a commodity. It is a cultural heritage, and it's good to see these kind of themes coming through strongly in the symposium. So thank you so much for choosing your hour to sit here.